like to go first? Facundo.
Sure.
We will start with Facundo Rivarola. He's a PhD student at Geneva Graduate Institute, but he's living now in Lausanne, right?
Yes.
And he's from Asunción in Paraguay, which is the capital. And you're actually not just in the anthropology department, but also in the sociology department.
It's combined.
Oh, it's a combined. Okay. And he's very interested in, which is, the common thread today is this issue of human-environment relations, or human and what does it mean for humans and the environment and development. As well as he's interested in socio-ecological conflicts, urban political ecology, social stratification, decolonial studies, and the politics of representation. But they all three promised me that today they are going to do their best to not speak in academic speak. And so I think we're going to be able to have a better sense of what all of that means after you present your work. And his doctoral work has been supported by the Swiss National Science Foundation. He's got the research grant. And it's been exploring environmental governance and ecological conflicts in Paraguay. And his goal with his research is to highlight the emerging and adapting forms of governing people in the environment in an era that's marked by climate uncertainty, as well as growing social and political inequalities. With that, I pass you the microphone.
Thank you.
And we are going to probably get up for, because he's going to show some slides.
Yeah, but I think I can just speak without slides, if you don't mind. And I think I'm fine without these slides.
Okay.
I was just showing some pictures, but I think I would try to, as an exercise, to see if you can imagine what I'm talking about as well without an image. As Payal was explaining, I'm a PhD, and thank you for coming and spending time here. And my research work is based in Asunción, the capital of Paraguay, and where I grew up, and that I'm most interested, and I keep going back home in a way. And my research have been focused on the politics of representation of people in the margins. And when we talk about the margins, and in my research, I don't necessarily talk of or the connotation of marginalized, of the poor and excluded, but the margins of people that live at the margins of degradation, of social degradation, environmental degradations, and in where historic group of people that historically have been denied rights to access to basic rights like housing, land, and so on. And my research focused on the floodplains of Asunción. Asunción is a city that is located in the border of the Paraguayan River. And the Paraguayan River is a long river that enriches the ocean, but because of this location, is experienced cyclical floodings, and the more marginalized communities that have lived in the peripheries, in the outskirts of the city, have this cyclical movement with the flooding of the river. So with the season, they move from the outskirts of the city and to the temporary camps in the city center. And then when the flooding season changes, they go back to their communities. And so they have this sort of continuum with the river, and they define themselves as semi-mobiles, and they have this rooted understanding of what is to live by the river, what is life in the floodplains. However, the city as imagined as a settled colonial Spanish settlement in the 15th century is challenged by this idea of mobility, and and somehow in more recent years, the government have pushed for this idea that these floodplains of the city are the belongs or is the natural space of the river and not of the people. So my research focused on how the rights of the people to inhabit in places and also rights to land rights can in direct conflict with this idea of the rights of the river. And so what I'm interested in my thesis is how conservative policies or how top-down environmentalism can actually be used against a group of people that have historically been denied access to basic rights and recognition of the right. And I don't know, I leave it there so then we can explore more and more time for the I hope it was clear.
Thank you. I think you really got right to the issue of how even today colonialism is alive and well, and what it means for the indigenous dwellers of a region. Now we move on to Jyothy Karat, who is our local anthropologist in training. She's originally from Kerala, South India, and is based here in Bern as a PhD student. But she's already had a very varied career. She's a filmmaker and photographer, in fact, a National Geographic explorer. And recently I was looking up some topic, I don't even remember what it was, and I saw this amazing photographic images of dancers in India, and then suddenly in the New York Times from a few years ago, and then I saw, oh my gosh, Jyothy was the photographer. And her documentary work has included stories about elephants in captivity, the human-animal relationality, and the displacement of indigenous communities in India. And India is a country in which, not by percent, but sheer numbers, the second highest number of indigenous people in the world, over 100 million people in India are considered to be indigenous. And for the past 10 years, you've had a major focus on the human-elephant relationship in India, documenting conflicts, but also collaborations and everyday encounters. You've made 2 films on the subject, and hopefully we can share links to those with the audience afterwards. And her master's thesis was also on this topic, and now she's going to tell us a bit more about that. But her PhD work is actually going to be, or is already started to focus on the political economy of green tech startups in India, and her work, which is continuing to do, and we had a little bit of a conversation at dinner about this, is combining fieldwork, storytelling, as well as stubborn curiosity about how do we as humans share space or not with wildlife. With that, thank you, Jyothy. Pass it on to you.
Thank you. Okay. I just want to thank Payal, really for putting all this together. It's a lot of effort. And thanks to Living Room as well. And thank you all for listening and for being here. Okay, so the reason why I even got into social anthropology and to academia was a very selfish one. It was mostly because of what was happening in my village, or where most of my childhood was spent, because there was a rising amount of human-animal conflict, and my family was suffering because of that. My family, my neighbors and stuff, and there was always this sort of accusatory remarks from my family that I'm going around doing stories about other things, other issues, other people, but not really doing anything about what was happening in my village or with our communities. So that's how I started, and my mother's family lives in this southern part of India, where it's called the Nilgiris, which translates to Blue Mountains. So it's called Blue Mountains because once every 12 years there is a blue flower that, or actually I think it's purple, but people think it's blue. But it blooms
Indigo.
once in it blooms once in 12 years, and that's how the landscape is. Yeah, it's just breathtaking. But then we have been seeing increasing level. I mean, it's not that human animal negative interactions are new or was never there before. It was always there, but it's been escalating. And then as a result, people are also asked to leave these regions because it needs to be conserved for the wildlife. Now, parallelly, I also have this other life, other than my personal life, as a filmmaker, photographer, etc. And I was living in the city called Bangalore, which is called as a Silicon Valley of India. Now that's where I met my husband, and he also had a similar story about Bangalore. And unlike me, because I was actually thinking that, we are so unlucky that my childhood space is changing so rapidly, but it was still there. Like the forests are still there, the mountains are still there, communities are still there, although some of them are being displaced. But for him, his childhood memories were already just that. Like, it's kind of like a distant memory. He doesn't see the lakes like it was there before. He doesn't see the green landscapes like he saw before. So it was like it was always this story of loss and belonging that he always constantly felt. And I was thinking that, it's not my village, it's not too far away from being that. And one way of addressing this, because I was also working as a journalist, was to tell stories about coexistence. Because this is what was missing largely from these narratives about conflicts. It was always positioned that humans were against non-humans, or vice versa, depending on whether you're pro-development or anti-development, whatever. So there was always this polarization, and there was always this ignorance of relational worlds, which is what I knew of and which I had grown up in. So that's what and also as a filmmaker and as a photojournalist, and also I think as largely as a function of me being a woman as well, I would be invited to a lot of discussions and plenaries and everything as more or less like as a motive. But then the knowledge or information I bring from the communities to these elite spaces don't get they are not legitimized. So then I thought research, and I need to ground my findings in science, and that's how I came to anthropology and started working on human elephant relations. And even for elephants itself, like if you look at South India, this where I grew up in, and the Silicon Valley is one large stretch of elephant habitat. And for us, it's like different cantons and it's different states and stuff. But if you look at how they move, how they function, and how they have been living in these spaces for years, you see that it's one connected space. And that's how the people who lived and who I worked with as well see this. So this is the kind of thing that I tried to bring out in my research, to kind of bring out the stories of relationality with elephants, how people understand elephants, but also how elephants understand people. And this is, I think, is my thing that I brought to my research, where anthropology seemed to be always looking only at the communities, and this time I was like, okay, but we could also look at it from the other way. I mean, it's a big branch in anthropology itself, but yeah, so I will stop at that.
Wow, I think these are, I don't know about you, but I think these are really good teasers. You're getting all of us, you're all very good storytellers. I'm kind of on the edge of my seat wanting to hear what comes next, but I also want to go to the next series. And I guess I would just say is in a way one can think about also this hierarchy of how many, not all, but many humans relate to animals,
yeah.
and what their value is or not to society. Yeah. Larissa, last but not least, you're not going to do it with drums, not with rhythm. You are going to do it with rhythm, but not a different kind of rhythm.
Yes.
So I'm also very excited that Larissa da Silva Araujo is here. She's a feminist, an activist, a postdoctoral researcher. Congratulations, you finished your PhD. That's a big thing, I know.
Oh.
And she's working currently in Geneva still at the Gender Center on the SWIFT project, contributing to research about the human rights framework on women and gender diversities rights in agricultural territories in Europe. And in a way, what I understand from when we spoke about it is it's actually like a chance for Europeans to learn from women agriculturalists in other parts of the world who are much better organized.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So that's really cool. And before she joined this center, she worked on her PhD thesis on sumac. How do you say it correctly?
Sumac
Kausai. So buen vivir, good living, amongst the Cayambis in northern Ecuador. She collaborated with women who've been undertaking agroecological transitions for healing bodies and territories, and she also did a master's in anthropology in Brazil, and she focused on the struggle of Afro-descendant women against the coloniality of mega events during the FIFA World Cup in Brazil.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for introducing me. I perhaps feel free, but there are spots here if you are sitting there on the back, if we're on the floor, whatever.
Should I do anything for your slides?
To pass it for the next one.
Kannst du, Julie, einfach... danke.
Thank
Sorry.
you.
Yeah. I think it's good.
Okay.
Maybe I sit that side.
Yeah.
Maybe
If you want.
or can you read? That's good.
Okay, so I had written because I tend to go everywhere, but my colleagues did such a good work on being storytellers that I kind of feel inspired of not attaching too much to the written text. So I grew up in Brazil. I was born in Brazil and grew up there and migrated to Switzerland alone 6 years ago to do my PhD here, but I actually did my work, the research I did for the PhD thesis was in Ecuador. So it's like a bit of a funny trajectory because I first did research in Brazil and then I moved to another country in the global south as well, and people look at me like, why would you do that, and why don't you stay in Brazil and do research in Brazil? And I kind of think that fortunately I had the privilege, after having the scholarship here, to do research where I think it's also interesting, as many people in the global north have the privilege of doing it. And also because I have worked with subjects that were touching me heavily in Brazil, working with people who disappeared and who died during the dictatorship. So it was a lot of tough work to do, and I decided that I wanted to actually do research on what are the alternatives. So not just of what is the bads or the crises that are happening in the global south, but actually what is emerging as an alternative. So very nerdy, so to say. I started reading about alternatives, and you might have heard already about the Zapatistas, or about many collectives doing alternative and community work everywhere. And I found this concept, the idea of summa causae, that was at the time when I started the PhD, it was a kind of a hype in Latin America as an alternative, and then it varies in the studies about as being an alternative of development, an alternative to capitalism, an alternative to neoliberalism, and an alternative of development. So there was already a sort of debate going on about this concept that comes from indigenous knowledge. So there are different ways of tracing the origins of what the idea of summa causae means, and different peoples that came together to propose it as a principle in the Constitution of Ecuador in 2008. And also there is a sister concept that is called summa camaña that was also proposed as a principle in the Constitution of Bolivia. So these two countries have very prolific indigenous movements, and they were being able to scale up their ideas to the national level. So I decided that I wanted to investigate what was summa causae, but I arrived to a landscape, an academic landscape, where people were mostly from different disciplines, but mostly from law and political science. And they were so 2008, I started my PhD 2017, so roughly 12 years later, 15 years later, people were saying that actually, summa causae, buen vivir don't exist, because in the hands of the state, so in Bolivia and Ecuador, there were development plans that were called plans of summa causae, plans of summa camaña, and but there was a lot of neo-extractivism going on in those countries as well. So criticals were saying, well, actually, this whole idea of buen vivir, it doesn't exist. And I felt it was a bit of a historical rush, and also some sort of epistemic racism, because we hang on with democracy for 2,000 years now, and we discuss and debate different kinds of concepts of democracy, representative democracy, participatory democracy, but we don't just trash it on the bin of history because it didn't work in some country. But that was what was happening in both scholarships in those two countries at the time. So that's the beginning of the story. Like, it's very nerdy, I know, but in the end of the day, as an anthropologist, I realized that there was not many groundings for these things. So people were analyzing public policies and laws, but not really what was happening in people's lives. So I proposed to investigate what was buen vivir in daily life. What is that indigenous peoples are doing, and what are they proposing that they conceive as buen vivir? So I went to Bolivia and to Ecuador. In the end of the day, I decided to stay in Ecuador because I'm a sole person doing research, and I wanted to have a deep connection and engagement with people. So instead of doing research in two places, which would be rushing things and not really capturing anything, and it, for the sake of being legitimate under the eyes of academic peers that want us to generalize things, and I was like, I don't want to generalize anything. I'm happy to stay with one community, and that was the case. I went to work with Cayambi people because they had the first indigenous mayor elected in Ecuador back then, and he was really pushing forward different understandings very concretely, also with the Indigenous Confederation that is the body that governs the territory of Cayambi people in Ecuador. They also had different strategies for making up buen vivir to happen in daily life, and that's it. I went to study Bem Viver there, and my thesis is really grounded into daily praxis of this concept. So we call praxis, the idea of praxis is when you act, then you have a critical thinking about this act, and then you act again based on your critical thinking. And that was really what was happening at the time. People were doing all kinds of projects, working in schools, teaching children Quechua, so Suma Causa comes from Quechua, learning them to speak Quechua because most of the population are Spanish speakers because of also epistemic racism. And then, in the end of the day, I worked with agroecological producers, so that are women that are going back to a form of agriculture that is respectful of nature, and it's producing organically, but it goes beyond that. And I leave it there, so I tell you more about agroecology in the eyes of Kayambi women later. I hope that it was okay for the 5 minutes Indian time.
Excellent, Larissa. And I'm going to go ahead and actually start with you because, you've touched on so many really interesting points, and I'm wondering if maybe you can share what is the essence of how it's worked in everyday life. And as a second point, I think this is also something that at times is really difficult because in order to scale something up like that, you do need the state, right? But when it's in the hands of the state, it can get screwed up, or nothing can happen. So based on what you saw about how it worked in everyday life, maybe you have some ideas or thoughts on how it could be effectively scaled up or quasi in the hands of the state.
Okay, so
and if you can really, I really like this idea about the praxis that you try and you see what happens and you build off of that. Maybe talk a bit about that cycle.
Okay, I need to write down, otherwise I forget and then I say whatever. So
that will also be interesting, I'm sure.
No, really, I go everywhere. I don't know how I finished it. I finished the PhD by writing things. Otherwise, it goes anywhere. So the question was, oh my God, this is so. I just got this. It's too technological. Create.
Those of us who are a couple decades older.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so state, praxis, and daily life. Okay. So I think the next slide shows it a little bit. So how it works in daily life. Really, the various interactions that I had in different spheres of life, so to say. Of course, people knew I was there as a researcher, and they would talk, right? They were like, oh, there is this Brazilian girl that I don't look like people there because I have curly hair, my face is different, but they were like, oh, how is it in Brazil? And they would always ask, how is it in Brazil? All the time, especially about, oh, what do you produce in Brazil? Because it's a place where there is a lot of agricultural production. And then they would start talking to me about their lives, and eventually they would speak of having a good life or having a good living or having a summa causa. I know that there was the factor that they were aware that I was there, but at the same time, really, I met people like dancing in this party. There was a guy that called me to dance, and he started speaking of, oh, now we recovered the community schools that were banned because the state wanted to build these very technological, they called millennium schools that were concentrating all the children with very high-tech material and so on. But then the community schools were being closed as a result of that. So he came to tell me that they were so happy during this party because they finally were able to reopen the school, and that's how they are finally recovering their good living. I was like, really? Come on, like, why are you telling me? I didn't thought that I would encounter people really speaking of the term. I thought that because the literature was being so suspicious about it not existing and saying that it was coming from elites in the state realm, that I find it surprising to meet people talking about this in different in different situations, quotidian situations. So one day I was walking around this field of corn that is called chacra. So you see that there is a house there, and the little field that people have in the back of their houses, they call it chacras, and that's where they are doing agroecology. But back then I was not even working with agroecology. And there was a volleyball court, and people were playing volleyball, and someone offered me a beverage after we played volleyball and said, well, you see, like, being here, cheering with everybody and having a sip of this beverage, this is good living. So I had really to be attuned to what was people telling about their lives and the times where they were, while enduring a hard life, at the same time they were craving ways to be happy, to have a good life, and most of all to have a life that is harmonious with nature. So it's different from the idea of well-being or the idea of having money to buy things and to have a good life in very Western way of conceiving what is a good life. It's really about being grounded and being able to share with others and being able to live in community life. And then, of course, you can say, oh, but this is almost idyllic. Like, not everyone has the chance to have some land in their houses to do agroecology, or to live in a community where you feel that you belong and then that you can raise your children together and so on and so forth. So how is it that Buen Vivir can happen in other places? And this question comes up a lot of times, and how we scale up and through the hands of the state. And I think maybe that's a bit of the anarchist within me. I don't think that Buen Vivir can be scalable. I don't think that we can pick a concept that is very situated, that was born in the views of indigenous communities, and try to scale it to other places, because that's how hegemonic systems becomes totalizing. Like, the idea that we can have the same life everywhere, it's authoritarian. So when they try to scale it up and make Buen Vivir plans in the hands of the Ecuadorian state, of course it's not going to happen, because it's a plural state. Like, essentially, they changed the constitution for indigenous nationalities to be recognized and for the state to conceive their nationalities as being able to govern their territories. This is something very, it's novel in Latin America, and I think it's interesting for other countries as well. Understanding that indigenous peoples have the autonomy to govern their territories, it's a different way of conceiving the country. And that's enough. Like, the idea that you can have one concept to rule the place where you live, it's an example that you can do this in different places, but you need to ground it in the knowledge of that place, right? So, for instance, working with the agroecological producers here in Europe, I've encountered people that are craving for understanding what is the indigenous of their lands, and to recovering what is the indigenous knowledge of those territories. Not to pick Buen Vivir and say to the government of the Netherlands that this is a great idea that worked in Ecuador, let's make it work here. They are trying to recover their ancestral knowledges and to work with nature based on that.
But couldn't one say that that it's actually much more value-based, and that here are some of the values, and one of those values is actually about localism, connection, another one, connection to nature, and that maybe it's not that it's formulaic, because what I hear you saying, which I agree, is that's what's gotten us into this mess in the first place, right? But perhaps one can pull out some of these foundations or these values, which then can be applied. And what I hear you saying is that without the local connection, it's impossible.
Yeah. So of course, I think we can try to recuperate. For instance, one idea that is central for good living is reciprocity. Okay, what is reciprocity in other contexts, right? In these contexts specifically, reciprocity was about exchanging seeds, or it was about exchanging time work. As a researcher, I was there exchanging with them and also working, like really working with them, because I was taking their time, so they should also have my time. So this was the kind of reciprocity that was going on there. So there are some principles that are under the idea of Buen Vivir, which is conviviality in harmony with nature in your community. So actually there is the next slide. Like they say that Buen Vivir, this is a way of representing their knowledge system. It's a symbol that is called chacana, and there is different chacanas in the Andes, and for Cayambi people, that's their chacana. One way of making emerging Buen Vivir is to have harmonious life in different spheres of life, which is the family, the community, the chakra, and the Pachamama, which they translate to geobiodiversity. Yeah. So you have to think of different spheres of your life and to apply principles of complementarity, reciprocity, and harmony. And harmony doesn't mean the lack of conflict, but the coexistence of different lives. We can't transport chacana to other local places, but people can be able to imagine in their realities how they could make those principles emerge, how reciprocity could happen, how solidarity could happen, how complementarity could happen, and so on and so forth. So I think that's why it was a failure for the Ecuadorian state, because they wanted to just use the word Buen Vivir instead of development, but they were being developmentalist anyways. They were trying to impose a way of conceiving development. Yeah, I think I explained.
Yeah. No, excellent. Thank you very much. Jyothy, so on the one hand, we got to hear from Larissa just now about that living harmoniously doesn't mean no conflict, right? Actually, when you try to avoid conflict, you make it normally worse, probably. Yeah. But in the case of your work, where you looked at the problem from the viewpoint of the elephants, as much as you could as a human, right? Is what were some of the conflicts, and where did you see that coexistence was working better between humans and elephants?
I mean, did conflict exist, or
no? What I'm assuming that the conflicts between elephants and humans were different based on different groupings of humans. Probably, maybe you want to share a bit about that. Yeah. And then, where was there this coexistence, or where the conflict was, less harsh?
Yeah, I think I should also give a bit of a context about this, how human-animal conflicts are also framed in India. I think media has a big responsibility in how it is being framed and narrated, and all how these stories are circulated, because in these stories they are always pitting humans against non-humans. But when you speak to the local communities, you would almost always find that their problem, they're never saying that please kill the elephant or kill the tiger or bear or whatever, but their complaint is, in my work at least, it's mostly against the state. That the state is not doing enough, or that they are biased in the way that they allocate resources. So in a lot of cases in the Nilgiris or even in Bangalore, you have like these huge highway projects, industrial areas being developed, etc. So that is allowed, and then you have like small communities who are asked to evict their villages in the name of conservation. Yes, thank you. So, so India has this fortress model of conservation where we have these protected areas, and normal people, we cannot just go into any of these areas. So they are supposed to be only for wildlife, and the forest dwellers are supposed to have certain rights, but it's only namesake. In reality, they don't really have much. They're kind of prisoners in their own villages. Even for me to go and work there, etc., like I had to pretend that I am their relative or friend or something, and even then there was a lot of disagreements between me and the authority to go inside and stuff. But this has always been the case, and if you look at the communities who actually live there, now I also hesitate to say indigenous, because this is also another problem there, because in one part of this elephant habitat where I worked, there are people who in India are called Adivasis. They are indigenous people who have been there for like thousands of years. And then in Bangalore, and they also have like traditional ways of dressing and things like that. So they're more easily recognizable. Now, our state, with all its colonial vestiges, have the same kind of treatment towards its people as the British had. And in Bangalore, these local communities have changed a lot. They dress like me. They have smartphones. They are much different. But that doesn't mean that they do not belong to those lands, and or they may have been nomadic communities who were forced to settle in certain areas. But there also they had learned how to live with elephants, and this was of great significance for me, because it's always also framed that only Adivasis knew how to live with animals, and this was not true. Like and the politics was directed in a way that, oh, these people are not categorized as Adivasis, so therefore they have to be sent out. They do not belong here. They do not know how to live with elephants. But in my work, what I found was that they do learn to live with elephants, and they develop institutions. Like they have these rules and regulations amongst themselves in a way that they can share these spaces. So this conflict was always this narrative that was being circulated amongst like the state, policymakers, whoever neoliberal actors you have there, and amongst the people, there always it was a human conflict than a human-animal conflict. What was it? Yeah. So this was this was like the part about conflict, and with coexistence also. There are different ways of coexisting. So the elephants also, and I think like with elephants, it's a bit easier to do this kind of research because they have such strong personalities. They are very social beings. They adapt. They're very clever. So in these more forested or like dense areas, you find that elephants have this they have like this elephants and the people have rules based on time and space and how it's used. So there are certain times that you don't go to a watering hole because you know that this is the time that elephants are going to come there. And there are they have like these little fields. Maybe they were growing pumpkin or whatever, and then they always have this kind of sense that you are sharing this space with other wild animals. So there is always a quota for the wild animals as well. So there's that tolerance that's already inbuilt. I mean, when I was there, I was kind of like, oh my God, like this thing that you grew, like it's all destroyed and everything. But then they're like, yeah, I mean, we share the space, so it's okay. So it's a completely different mentality. It's also, you can see it in the way that they live, like they are living inside the forest. You don't see oak or redwood or whatever fancy furnitures and stuff, like the way that they live. There's no grid, and there's no electricity, there is no water and stuff. But then also, like, it doesn't mean that they also want to live like that forever. They also want to move out. They want their children to be educated, etc. But then with this sort of displacement that is forced on them with this sort of fortress kind of conservation model, all these kind of knowledges are also lost. Because even the children there, like, they could smell elephants at a distance. It's really amazing. Like, you'll see them like just walk back from school. They walk 5 kilometers back from school because school is really far and stuff. And then there'll be like this, there is this animal called Nilgiri Gaur. It's kind of like a bison, like imagine a big buffalo, but they're very, very dangerous. And they'd be like herding somewhere in the patch, and they just know how to walk by without a problem. And so these kind of knowledges, it's not really recorded. And ironically, like, even biologists or zoologists who study these animals and make all the scholarly papers and scholarship and all that, they're also working with the locals. But it's always translated to a science that somehow works against them in the end. But their work itself, or their knowledge itself, is, or they themselves are never legitimized. So in even, and with Bangalore also, they're also like where they are not supposedly Adivasis. In the 65 years or 70 years that they have lived there, also they have developed certain rules, certain ways of singing. It's even evident in the way that they sing their folk songs, for their festivals, that welcoming elephants, incorporating elephants into their, we have a god called Ganesha, which is an elephant god. So they kind of merge these wild stories with their religious beliefs, and they have a way of working, but in the end, and we also, in India, technically we have systems where policymakers and the state, etc., are supposed to listen to and consult the locals, but it never really actually works. So I think, like, in a way that it's also the responsibility of civil society to do the listening that the state is not doing, which I think scholars can do, media can do, that sort of careful listening and legitimization that needs to be done. I mean, if not for them, I mean, even for us, like, it's, yeah. I think I really digress from your question.
No, it was really great, and I think sets up for what we want to talk afterwards. And I think what I'm hearing from you, though, is that really that the framework that the state uses, as we said, when the British left, that the white Rajas were replaced with the brown Rajas.
Oh yes, totally.
So that we essentially have a framework that does not acknowledge or place value on the knowledge of indigenous communities, and that they actually have come up with a solution that's being destroyed by a framework that doesn't make space for other ways of thinking.
Yeah.
So I think we'll get back into who tells the stories, who listens, what do we do. Let's go back on our trip. It's going to take us a while because we don't want to fly. We're going to head back to to Latin America, to Paraguay. And we've already talked about. There's already so many parallels I'm seeing between your work and Jyothy's work, even though this was about elephants, because it's actually about human interaction. We already touched on that the neo-colonialism of the situation, but from what I understand from you, in doing this work, it's not just about documenting and understanding the communities, but also seeing that they do have agency, that they are trying to make change. What is it that the communities are fighting for, and where do you see that there's potential despite the neo-colonialistic city and state?
Actually, it's very, as was here in these cases, and because I work with these communities that first is in an urban context, and these communities are originally indigenous, mestizos, rural migrants, that are brown skin, Afro-descendants, and in the context of environmental or proposing alternative or knowledge also, sometimes we refer to the indigenous as with certain validity, that because of a colonial context of mestizaje and displacement after displacement after displacement, these communities that I work with, somehow they're too indigenous for the city, but not indigenous enough to propose alternatives, valid alternatives. And that is a very peculiar context of Latin American indigeneity, and there's this concept of the allowed Indian, and this is Indian in Spanish, el indio permitido is a derogative generally concept, as you say, it's someone indio as a prejudice, and this concept take the irony on that term and said, okay, there are certain ways of being indigenous that is allowed. And Paraguay specifically is a country that 80% or more of the population, but I think the last statistic were 80%, speak the indigenous language, Guarani, as the first language, more than Spanish. It's the indigenous language that's more spoken by non-indigenous people. So 80% of the population of the country speak Guarani as a first language, but they don't recognize themselves as indigenous. And it's the only indigenous language in the world that is most spoken by non-indigenous people. But and it's compulsory in the schools, and we learn this. And however, when we learn the Guarani language, we never learn about the philosophy of how the indigenous knowledge of how to co-live with the environment. And so I was very, in a way, I interested of how this idea of mobility came into understanding of how you relate with flooding as something that is not destructive, that is not an environmental disaster, that is not a crisis. It's the water come, we move, and then we come back. And in colonial times, these areas of the floodplains, where the movement was semi-nomadic group would come as psychically, and the Spanish will enslave these communities, and they will stay in this area forever, and that's how they start building. And today it's not only indigenous, but it's a mix, and these knowledges are not necessarily, there are people who live or who in this area are not saying we have the indigenous knowledge of proposing an alternative, but because of their life in the margins, and the margins not just in margins of the city, but also in the margin of land, of water, of nature, like flora, fauna, and concrete, and pollution, because these are areas that are heavily polluted. And however, they are refuge, not only for different knowledges and move of histories, but also of animals, and in a way, by challenging this colonial, colonial idea of a fixed, permanent place to live as the city, and by challenging having this somehow unsettled idea of urbanization, it had allowed certain form of relations with other animals. And for example, there are big migratory birds that have the space when the floods come and the people are not there. The migratory birds have the place to land, to feed, and with the increases by creating this ecological reserve and building roads and creating some infrastructure, for example, these birds didn't have the place to land anymore. And so they went into the city for the first time, causing electricity cuts, and for 2 nights the city was with no electricity because these big birds stayed in the cables and caused and so in a way by allowing this movement, these communities were allowed in certain form of co-living with the environment that conservation policies or not necessarily development policies don't recognize. But at the same time, and I think there is what I want to do with my research is to show that it's not that people have this deliberately political intention to propose an alternative, but people live that alternative because that is the way that people that live in the margins, excluded, degraded, in every context, degraded environmentally, degraded socially, degraded as an identity, and degraded as dispossessed. What I like to call more than displaced, the dispossession. That there are people that are dispossessed of their identity constantly, historically. People that are dispossessed from their lands. That are dispossessed and so people live that already. People are. It's not that they are. And I'm very careful not to put that responsibility also on the people and saying they're already surviving a long history of exploitation and surviving, and now they have also to propose an alternative to already this destroyed world that have already there. And I try not to put that responsibility on the people, but saying that people were living that kind of life already and proposing an alternative that is there or is so there it's a peculiar context in my case that is not too indigenous for the city and not indigenous enough to be proponent of alternative. And so they say actually seen as the polluters. So the policies and the government says that these communities are the pollutants of the environment, that they come and they occupy land, they occupy nature, and they should live elsewhere, without recognizing the long history that these areas were never empty floodplains. There were already a movement of people, and there is a history of colonial history of slavery that made these places habitable, and so I trace that.
So in a way, also again, it's that the framework is not accepting people who are indigenous to the region and the way in which, or the city and the way in which they're living. And it reminds me, I worked a lot with slum dwellers in Mumbai, and there's 2 issues. One is that they are really people. It's not the same that they've been there forever, but they come into the city because the city needs the workers, but people don't want them to live in the city. Yeah. So they should, travel up, down 2 days or 2 hours each way. And then on the other hand, very often people complain, we built flats for them and they didn't go, but they were not involved in what it's going to look like. And they actually have similarly communities and a rich fabric of relations in the slum that is then completely destroyed. So I think it's, again, this piece. I want to give the chance for the audience to ask some questions. I want to I want to just ask one same question to all of you, and I'll ask you to be brief, even though it's not a very brief topic. But one of the issues that we all spoke about is colonialism or decolonialization. And recently there was an article from Patrick Gatara, who's a Kenyan journalist, and he talked about the need to decolonize journalism with a focus on who owns the stories that the journalists tell and what do journalists owe to those they report on. And I think we could very easily replace journalism with anthropology or research. I think activists like myself also should ask ourselves these questions. And so how do you see it? Who owns the stories that you document, and what is your role to those communities? Because I think, Jyothy, you spoke specifically about their stories aren't legitimate, they're not legitimatized, and that they do need to get out, and that there is a role. But, who owns those, who tells them? And I guess I'll give each of you a chance to respond to that, and then we open it up to all of you for your questions and comments.
Can go first. No, since we were already talking about, I think, this question of ownership, I think is also such a Western concept.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because the communities I work with, they are very, very generous. They don't trust very easily to begin with, but once they have accepted you, they think of you as one of them, and they really don't have this idea of property, which is why I think they are also able to coexist in these spaces with wild animals and also all other kinds of animals as well. But I think with visual mediums it was a bit easier. And with anthropology, I think it's much harder for me to kind of incorporate them in a more legitimate way. With filmmaking, for example, I could have them in front of the camera. They are saying whatever they want to say, and then I can craft those stories accordingly. And when you show them the film that you have made, there is a sense of ownership that they have also, and they feel like, okay, this is my story or our story that we wanted to say, and I'm also always quite honest with them, that I say nothing may happen, may come off this thing, but I am also trying as you are, as we all are. So and I think that much is enough, and I think they are also, and these are also very long-term relationships that you form. You become friends, and
Yeah.
So that was much with anthropology. I find it, and also even with forums like this, we were able to bring our interlocutors to become part of these conversations, to speak. I never had to speak for them. Which is why I never thought that they needed a voice. They already had.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just that they didn't have as many platforms as I would have got. So that was one way of, building these narratives together. With anthropology, I think it is so elitist. I still don't know how to go about it in a more participatory way or in an ethical way. And of course there are participatory methods of research and stuff, but I don't think that's enough.
Do you think there's a possibility of you combining your filmmaking with your research background?
Yes, but there are so much of structural limitations, because filmmaking is very expensive, and you have to do your master's or PhD or whatever in these limited time, and then I only have 24 hours, so it's
Yeah, okay,
So
it's not so easy.
quite, it's quite difficult. But one thing that I do try to do is, at least I kind of try to not to anonymize, although like anonymization is quite a common practice in anthropology also, but then I wouldn't anonymize because I'm like, people want to be seen and heard.
Yeah.
And yeah. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Facundo, Larissa?
In my sense, is the question of authorship is something that in anthropology is we discuss, and there's a crisis of representation in the sense of anthropology started to question how we go about representing others. And there, my problem is that it can become emancipatory project, saying that anthropologists we are giving voice to the voiceless, and that is also a bit is to start with the pretentious analysis. Who are we to give voices to the other? And there are this institutional. We are finishing a thesis, or we are publishing, or we becoming professors, and while having this altruistic goal of giving voice to the voiceless. And then I have that violence in my own work, in the sense of I'm from Paraguay. I do research in Paraguay, but in 10 years of my career, I never mentioned I grew up in these communities. And then the moment I wrote a very personal piece of growing in the flat plains and in our government housing that get flooding until these days, and the moment I put myself, I was suggested not to finish my PhD. So I take it that me as a Paraguayan, as a discipline I was allowed to a certain degree to do research back in Paraguay and have this, as long as I kept that emancipatory giving voice to the voiceless. But as soon as I introduce myself and put it as a center of my research, that was challenged as being too personal or not scientific enough or not academic enough and being too biased. And so it's this constant negotiation of yes, it's important to see the positionality of one researcher and to see how I'm questioning this issue, how I'm addressing the people I work with from my own point, but it's also a bit superficial, and if you go beyond that, it's also a challenge as a discipline. And it's that constant negotiation between the authorship, and we can say that knowledge production is in itself a violent process, in the sense that you talk to people that realities are so different, and there is a violence in that, because it's not the way that knowledge is recognized. It's not always seen as through the collective process that required to develop a knowledge. But I think there are other experiences that show that it's possible, and I think Larissa can speak more about that.
So cute, thank you.
Very, very nice bridge.
Yeah. Well, okay. So I think, very humbly, I think what Jyothy does, it's so nice. I think that you should have shown like videos, and because I really I tried to learn to do something that would be useful, because there was a very to the point criticism when I arrived to work in this place. I said up front, I have an agenda, which is study Buen Vivir, but we can change this. I don't I have the privilege to start a PhD, but I want to craft this research with you because these stories belong to you. So we went through a formal process of going about the research design and so on and so forth. But from the beginning, people were very critical about there is a lot of researchers that come here and we never see anything else from what they do. It doesn't matter if we don't understand your articles, but show us something, because it seems like a waste of our times. And when I started working specifically with agroecological producers, because one, I was living with one, so it was kind of obvious, but at the same time, they were going through a process of doing a very important work of recording how it was for them to bring their struggles to the state and to create public policies. So they managed to fight against the state that were taking them off from the streets and say, we need a market, we need a space for a market. You people keep saying that agroecology is a niche for rich people, but we are actually trying here to heal the land and to provide food for people, healthy food. And I didn't speak a lot of the context and so on, but they are among like flower plantations that pollute a lot the environment. All the roses that you see in Valentine's Day come from Ecuador and Kenya and Colombia. And people are really trying to do something for the health of nature and their health. But they concretely, materially, they didn't have where to sell their products. And they did the whole bureaucracy of crafting a public policy and being able to have a legislation that enables them to work. This work was documented in a book, and it didn't mention them as agents of this public policy process. It mentioned them as participants of NGOs' workshops. And they were very fed up with that. They were like, that's not the case. And there are pictures of the discussions with people from the municipality, from the Ministry of Agriculture and so on, in the house of the agricultural producer. Like, it was not in the state building, okay? So they were really agents of pushing for change, but the book represented them as participants, not as agents. So I arrive in this context where people, and that's the praxis, right? It's acting and it's critically thinking about their acting and acting upon it. So they were like, we are not accepting researchers anymore that come here with nothing in hand. So in this sense, they were not saying that you owe something to our stories, but we should work together. And that's kind of obvious, but not really, right? Why they were complaining? Because that's their realities. People are coming there all the time and just leaving without reciprocating with anything. So they were at the time doing also workshops. The agroecological producers, they were doing workshops in schools. Remember, the community schools were being reopened and so on. So they wanted to teach whoever wanted to learn, but especially fathers and mothers, how to raise native plants to enhance the nutrition of the children, because there was a huge problem with anemia and other kinds of malnutrition. UNICEF was there doing their development programs and so on, not criticizing UNICEF per se, but there was an issue there, and they were trying their best to contribute with that from their standpoint of being an agroecological producers that have a ton of knowledge about plants. So in the end of the day, I was like, okay, maybe what we can do together, and that's what I really humbly tried to do, because I'm not a botanist, I'm not a biologist, and I'm far from being like a filmmaker, or I have, my knowledge is to write, and poorly. So we decided to make a book together about their plants. So that's the little book here that there is lots of plants. I think if you go for the next slide, you can find it in Spanish. But it's essentially a way of, it's documenting their knowledge for them. So I'm fine with not translating it to other languages, because it's a situated knowledge. It doesn't matter if we can't, because they're plants from this space, the knowledge is from there, and it's going to make sense there. I think if other people wants to take it as an example of how we can reciprocate, right? The knowledge is from them, and is going to stay with them. And once I did a presentation about this book, very short, because we had a bit of financing, which is a blast, for printing the book, for having the physical one. And I did a presentation, and someone came to say, wow, you have a whole database about plants. We should work together and put it in my app. Because the app of this person was, he were able to, from talking to, like, you talk to the AI, what is your symptoms, and then the AI tell you what plants you should use. And I was like, here in Switzerland, I was like, do you understand the concept of situated knowledge? I won't give you, and this don't belong to me, but you, and it's a guy coming from Bolivia. And the pitch was, we from Latin America need to learn how to make money. Yeah. And I was like, but I don't want to make money. You didn't understand my presentation. That I don't want to make money from this book. They are selling in their fairs, in the market.
Local knowledge.
Yeah. For them, it makes sense. That's a way of promoting the fairs. It's a way of promoting the plants. It's a way of consumers to learn how to use the plants and what are the recipes. And also what they shouldn't do. Because people sometimes it's like, oh, I will turn into a shaman if I do this plant with this other plant. And no, people know how to specifically use the plants in different ways because it's an accumulated of ancestral knowledge. So they wanted this to be shared in the space where they were intervening with their workshops and so on. But it's amazing to see how, like in academia and I don't know, startups. My God, this capitalist mentality. Why don't you share your database? It's like, because it's not my database, first of all, and it's not the purpose. Like the purpose is to do something else with not giving voice for, but with the people that I worked with. This is not my thesis. My thesis is something else. I know that I'm building my career with the kind of knowledge that I gained there, but at the same time, what can I do that is useful for them? It was this. We decided to do this together. It was not like a genius idea that I had. Actually, I wouldn't have because I'm not a botanist.
So I think this is a great example of ways in which one can be responsible with the knowledge and towards those who are the holders of the knowledge. And thank you for that, Larissa. And thank you for bringing also the copy. And there are so many questions I could ask them, but all of you have been listening very intently the last hour and a half, and I know you have different experiences and ideas, so I want to open up the floor to anybody that wants to make a comment or ask a question. Rika.
Thank you very much for those wonderful presentations, and they all link together really wonderfully. I have something which I'm trying to connect all three of you, but I think it'll not work. I really like the term that you used, Facundo, like the indigenous, not indigenous enough for the city. And I think that connects to what Jyothy's presentation was also these people who are categorized as indigenous, the Adivasis, and then the others who are supposedly encroaching the land. And there I see the role of a state in a more diffuse manner, or I'm not so sure, it's more ambiguous. It's not black and white. The state is not just the white colonialist being replaced by the brown colonialist. There is something more to it. So India, as you know, is an extremely unequal society, extremely discriminatory society even today. 75 years after the constitution, it's still a very discriminatory society. And one of the attempts of the state over the last 7 decades has been to give access to land, because agriculture, a lot of people are still dependent on agriculture. And colonial policies saw land as useful and not useful. So anything that was the commons, they were classified as wastelands, because for the British perspective, there was no timber to be had, no agricultural produce to be had. the commons were wasteland, right? And this definition still remained, and the wastelands were then being distributed by the state. And those are the people who come from the lower parts of society. They don't count as indigenous, but kind of are still not the elite. And they are the ones who have been given those lands by the state. And then they are being taken away again when it comes to conservation, because that's the other idea. You have to exclude people from there. So I think the role of the state is not so kind of clear-cut. On the one hand, you're trying to do some good. And the other comment is to Larissa. It's kind of also a little bit playing the devil's advocate. You said scaling up to Payal's question. Scaling up is kind of not possible, and I understand where you're coming from. But isn't federalism pretty much scaling up, having communities control their lives? And last year I was in Malaysia, and Sabah and Sarawak are two states of Malaysia which are, I don't know the exact numbers, but it's kind of mostly indigenous populations. And when we were in Sarawak, and you really notice the state of Malaysia doesn't really exist in Sarawak. It's all Sarawak and different indigenous communities in Sarawak. So I think there is an argument to be made that you can have scaling up, but of course it's very context specific and to a community. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rika. Did anyone want to respond to her, or?
I have the question of the states is also is key, because as you said, when I was the first time I went to back and I was interviewing people, and people were saying, and I was very interested to look at flooding, how people define flooding as not something disruptive or if was disruptive, and people refused to talk about flooding and the river. And they said, the river is not a problem. Yes, we know there's a season we move. What we struggle the most is with the state. The state is the one. The river doesn't displace us. It's the state that doesn't want us to be here. It's not the river that come and take our land away. And so then I started asking, what is the state? And how people define the state. And it's extremely difficult to locate the state. What is the physical? It's a physical thing. It's an abstract thing, and the way that we refer to the state is so vast and so different. And so to locate or to define what is the state is extremely difficult. Who is the state? There are politicians. Sometimes people were saying they in plural, they the state. So I started thinking, who are they? And they would refer politicians, they would refer political parties, NGOs, international organizations, specific individuals in the community that were having more ties to a certain political party in power. And so yes, the state is always this elusive. It's that capacity that is so present, but at the same time so violently absent in people's life. And that's something I still struggle so much, and try to write this chapter about the state as something that is this omnipresent. It's always there, but never there at the same time. And that's a good reflection of that leads to your question. So thank you.
I think you should catch a drink with Reka, because she's quite an expert on federalism and governance. So probably have some good comments for you. Other questions? Yes.
Maybe you have another.
No.
I just thought about. Can you say something about how are the communities organized politically, or maybe not politically, but do they meet? Do they organize somehow?
Okay. I did like a sort of a comparative study between these two regions, and they work very differently in both the regions. And in the area where they were living inside the forest, they had like informal communities. I mean, we have this structure called panchayats, like they're at the very, the most basic unit of governance, say. But this is like even more, even not even recognized as a panchayat, like it's more like just a community gathering, and they have their elders and stuff, and there they try to organize themselves, they try to make committees, they try to collaborate with lawyers who can kind of argue for them, but then really their bargaining power is very, very low, because even like the journey to the collector's office, like to the government offices itself, is something that they cannot always afford. That's the situation in one area. In the other area, they are more politically organized. They align with dominant political parties in those areas, and these political parties also in turn use them as well for their gains. And it's kind of like, it's a bit sad also, because they know they could be exploited, but they also don't have a lot of say in it. And this also like works quite counterproductively quite a few times, because then the politicians, what they do is they encroach land in the name of these communities, and then the communities get like a bad repo. But I've also seen like some successful campaigns that the communities did in collaboration with scholars, documentary filmmakers, and politicians as well, and lawyers. So this is like a very unique thing that I've not heard otherwise, but this was in Bangalore also, where they are closer to the city, they have more access. It's not like the other area where they are more isolated. So their campaign worked, and it got media attention, it had political will behind it, it had legal aid, and they were also standard indigenous. The government recognizes them as Adivasis, so it worked, but not with other communities in the same region. So you also see like the law doesn't seem to apply to everyone in the same way. It's kind of like, but yeah, they try and align themselves as much as they can.
So in the case of Ecuador, thank you for mentioning. I really want to know more. What is the Malaysia case for making comparisons there? So indigenous peoples in Ecuador, they were not always indigenous enough. They were quite marginalized for like until 2008, until they were able to have their rights recognized in the constitution, including like at the beginning of the century, for instance, when they started organizing. Of course, that was also, we have to remember, the language of the time, how people would speak of communities back in 800 or in the 900s, in the
1800s.
18 and 19, like it was indigenous, but also when you wanted to detach from indigenous, you were a peasant, at least in the Latin American context, in the Ecuadorian context. So a lot of communities were called campesinos, and they actually organized as such. Like they would have the help, for instance, of the Communist Party, and they would have a lot of injection of leftist ideas, because it was coming from this understanding of what is campesino, the way of life of the campesino, and so on. Nowadays, in Ecuador, when it was recognized as a plurinational country, it's quite strange, because it's still one state, but it recognizes different nationalities, and it's not nations, it's nationalities. In the US they call nations, in the Ecuador they call nationalities. The structure follow as such, and there is not really a hierarchy between the structures, but there is a flow. So there is indigenous communities that is actually like your neighbors, and the little territory that you share with them. There is a lot of history of how these territories are conceived, and also a lot of colonial history. It's a lot related to agrarian reform, when landlords, overseeing that the state wanted to do agrarian reform, donated the badlands, the wastelands for the workers that were actually almost enslaved. They used to live in the farm and work for the landlord their whole lives and their families and so on and so forth. They were called wasipungos. And so when the agrarian reform happened, what the landlords did, they donated the lands for the wasipungos, and the little conglomerate of lands would constitute a community. You normally have a committee that rules the community, but you have to there are 3 rules for being part of a community. You have to be on the list of the community, you have to perform collective work, and you have the council. So these 3 rules are the ways that a community constitutes. To be enlisted in the community is basically you or your grandparents were there since then. If you migrate, if you marry with someone, you can also be enlisted, but essentially it's the dweller. So who lives in that place belongs to the community, as long as they also contribute with collective work and they participate in the cabildo. Why is this important? Because this council, which is the cabildo, they change the persons that participate in there every 2 years. And as a community dweller, you have to participate. So Payal was 2020, 2022. In 2024, it's my time. And then, you are obliged to be a ruler for some time. You have to learn how to govern the territory, which is a blessing and a curse. Not everybody wants to govern a territory, but at the same time, everybody gets to understand this position. They are trying to implement that the places in the council are paritary, so half women, half men. It's becoming more common because they have this idea of complementarity. So gender complementarity is that before it was used a lot to supplement the woman's voice, to say you are the male part is imported in the public sphere and you are imported in the private sphere, and then they started saying, over my dead body, we are all imported in all spaces, and I want my voice to be heard in the assemblies. And actually participating in the agroecological groups, it's helping women a lot because they learn how to be more vocal and to speak up in public spaces. So that's the little unity of community. Then you have the indigenous confederation of these communities. In the case of the Cayambi people, is the Cayambi People Confederation. And then you have the regional. So in Ecuador, we have 3 main regions, which is the coast, the Andes, and the Amazon. And those 3 organizations belong to the bigger one, which is CONAIE, which is the National Confederation of the Ecuadorian Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities. This is a political body for the indigenous communities, but they are all equally important. Then there is a political party that the CONAIE, so the national, created, and they are separate. People can participate in the political party or not, but they tried to separate because they actually didn't want these political party struggles to be injected into the structure of the governance. So they were like, hell yeah, we should go to try and enter the state, but we also have our own structures and we don't want these to be together. Complicated?
Yeah.
I talk a lot.
No, that's great. I think we ask one final question or comment. Yeah.
So I liked a lot this. I like the comment on summa causa, like that it didn't work on the state level, and that it's important to use the local that it always local based, And also like in Switzerland we have like this Allmende, like the commons, which is an old practice, but also maybe a belief system maybe we need also more research. And my question also dives a bit in this, like we need, or I'm coming from a point of view, we need like a global revolution, and like, but we need to upscale certain stuff, but how that it works, and it's not like, again, doing the same mistakes, or like, yeah, maybe federalism is an option. I don't know, maybe you have like from your research ideas, or...
From the research, not really. I think, like, from an activist point of view, I don't know, maybe that's a bit obvious to say, but working different alternatives together is more interesting than trying to scale up one alternative. Because, I mean, nothing against what we had with the experiences of socialist and communist countries. Like, I think in several places it worked, but at the same time we have stories of how authoritarianism took over the alternative, and yeah, so perhaps federalism is a way of going about, but I think to replace one hegemon we should have an heterogeneous hegemon. Like, actually capitalism is heterogeneous. We keep thinking that it's homogeneous. It's not. It's heterogeneous, and it's ripping off solidarity work, reproductive work, right? Like, it's still based in enslavement. Like, it's not one economic system ruling. It's extracting the work that works in different economic systems and playing out as if it was an hegemon, an homogeneous hegemon, but it's actually an heterogeneous one. Very, very conceptual and theoretical, but...
maybe you could also have a look at the Commons Association, the International Association for Commons, and what they try to do is study the commons. I mean, it's kind of like a offshoot of Alina Nostrom's study in the commons as well. But then I find that like quite fruitful in the way that like Rekha was saying that in India also, like, it's a lot of the commons are considered as wastelands, but now there is also different conceptualizations what commons are. Like, so like human-animal relationality can be considered a common that needs to be protected. Local knowledges as commons, and so there's engagement with scholarship, with policymakers and stuff. So they're trying to do a lot of stuff. How effective they are, I don't know, but it's something useful, I think.
Sorry, could I maybe add? 2 weeks ago, a colleague of mine, he just published a big review over all academic literature that was published on commons related to housing, and there he conceptualized the different definitions of commons, and he comes up with 5 different definitions, and it's so broad, so maybe if you want to study that also, but it's also very much, I think, related to, so the literature is very much related to Europe.
Okay, with that, I want to thank all of you for joining, and I realize I forgot to mention a big thank you to the Living Room. For those of you who don't know about it, it's a center that started maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and a combination of activists and artists have come together to create this space. The collective is shifting at the end of the month. They are going to Sulgenlein, where they will join with Klimastreik, with Haus der Bewegung, Wir Alles in Bern, and quite a number of other groups in a space that will open, I think, in September. Yeah, and it's a really cool space. They're having a goodbye party for this space on Saturday. You should come. I think it'll be a lot of fun. And the collective is cool. Anastasia and Olga and others are part of it. And we did this with almost no financing. If you are able to, please add something to the collector. I can't find the proper collector, but so that we can just cover the costs of train rides, and we also have an apéro with drinks and snacks. So feel free to stick around. I think I know that I could have talked for another hour with the three of you. I think we only were able to touch the surface on some topics, but yeah. Other than that, thanks a lot for coming, and if you want to see more events with guests from the Global South, come and talk to me. We can see what we can do. And Stephanie is also here from Politforum, who organizes a lot of great events. I don't know if anything you want to announce at Politforum that's happening.
Well, next week, it's not. We're going to open a new exhibition on AI and democracy. And we actually work with the Graduate Institute in Geneva. They did research on that also.
And my colleagues in my office made your...
the design. Yeah. It's now in production, so should be there just in time for the opening.
Anybody else wants to make an announcement about an event or a theater show or a dance or whatever, or meeting? Okay, well then, really a big thank you to all three of you for preparing, for two of you taking a long trip to come to Bern. And I hope some of you can stay for a drink with us. And if you are able to afford it, please drop something in the collector so you can offset the cost. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks to all of you. Nice job.
I wanted so badly to make the question for them, my dear.
Which one?
I know. I thought about.
But people are tired. Like,
yeah. No, I thought about it in the very beginning doing it, but I know it's difficult.
Okay.
And then I also just thought with the time we will be tight. Otherwise, I do that sometimes. Like I do, like where I have it that they speak to somebody next to them, and then we collect 2 or 3 answers.
Okay.
Yes.
Phew. Always like, oh my God. Chocolate. I have 2 or 3 things to say, and then I and sometimes I don't know if it even makes sense. I guess. Yeah. I guess so.
Should I just leave these glasses here, or maybe?
That was mine.
This Facundo's, maybe
That's
he also wants to drink
yeah.
some more.
We are still recording.
Yeah, we should just stop.